Azzam. My name is Michel Andaus. I'm a Lebanese Christian. My question to Dr. Mitri on the first point you started with on the competition for victimhood. And I wonder whether you have a sense of where did this begin, where did it come from? It seems that Christians throughout their history, even before Islam, had this sense of constant victimhood. And the other side to this question is a sense of high self-esteem or superiority, which reflects a lot in all the talk about Christian contribution as if it's something special, or as if Christians, when they do something, it has to be a Christian contribution, and not just simply a contribution to society they live in. So it's a very complex phenomenon. In a way, it's not necessarily the same throughout history, but I wonder, in your use and in the current context, whether you have a sense where is this coming from, and what purpose does it serve?
I certainly agree with you that part of it has to do with historical memory of Christians. It's a memory of having been marginal, but at the same time having played a role that outweighs their numerical importance. The second is a source of pride, and the first is a source of anxiety. And this combination of both, I think, is to some extent responsible for this sense of extraordinary victimhood that they have today. But I try to suggest, I'm a Christian myself, and I fully understand and feel in my own psyche, as it were, some of what my fellow Christians feel. But I think in today's world, in today's Arab world, I was talking about today's Arab world, with all that is happening throughout the region, with all the blood that has been spilled, with the destruction of eastern Aleppo, the way we see, this claim to extraordinary victimhood is not in conformity with the Christian universal ethics, is not in conformity with the gospel values. And I wanted to express this. I also wanted to say what Fateh had said more eloquently in his presentation, that if you're advocating the right of victims who happen to be members of minority communities, then it's the right of all. And you cannot single out a specific group. Comparisons is a problem. I remember once I was giving a lecture in Trondheim, Norway, of all places, and I spoke about crimes of war, crimes against humanity in Syria. And then there was a lady in the room who said, "But you didn't say anything about genocide of Christians in Syria." I said, "But Christians in Syria, just like Muslims, probably Muslims more than Christians, are victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity. No matter how I abhor the regime of Assad, there is no genocide in Syria I'm aware of, neither against the Sunni Muslims nor against the Christians." I mean, so to exaggerate the nature of what makes victims victims is not a service we're rendering to them.
I'm an Episcopal priest, and Fateh, I really want to acknowledge your talk and the tension that I live in listening to what you say, in that, I started an organization called Stand with Iraqi Christians in recognition of the genocide going on in Iraq. And I could not agree more that, any minority that's being persecuted is equally deserving of protection. I think living in the real world, it's important for people to be able to take action. The problem is so huge. It's so big, the persecution of all religious minorities. I would love to know your idea in a real world way, how you go about talking to and encouraging action to a fairly complacent population. The reason we've been able to make a difference in Iraq is because we are a small Christian community responding to a Christian need, the idea that some of the oldest Christian communities are being wiped out. I think if I had made this stand with all persecuted minorities in the Middle East, I think I'd have gotten nowhere. So again, coming out of academia and broad ideas, what I always say to people, I have a film that I made over there, and I screen it, and people sometimes say, what about the Yazidis, and what about the Muslims? And I say, hey man, I would love it if someone started an organization called Stand with Iraqi Yazidis. I've got a great process for you. I've got a great template that I can share with you. So I'd like to know how you take such a huge, broad problem and really get people to take action, because what I found is that a Christian community will get its heart stirred by a Christian issue, but I go way out of my way to say we're not anti-Muslim, we're not anti any other group, but it's hard getting people motivated. It's hard getting people's attention. And I'm interested in results. I'm interested in making an impact because people are definitely really suffering, and I want to do something about it. So I'd love to hear your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, these are very difficult problems. The problem that you are dealing with actually is how to motivate your community. That's not necessarily dealing with the problem of genocidal acts against the Chaldean Christian community in Iraq. So in that sense, if I may be so bold, I suggest you are possibly doing the reverse utilitarian use of sectarianism for mobilization purposes that could create, that could even help deepen sectarian division. If I were a Yazidi from Iraq and I end up in the United States and I go to your community or I go to an event that your organization has set up to protect the Christians, and I will say, but that happened to me, and unless what I'm anticipating from you is that there are, Yazidis should organize to protect Yazidis, and Christians can organize to protect Christians, and Muslims can organize, Shia can organize to protect Shia, and that's this way, it can take care of everybody. But it doesn't really work that way, because the longer-term effects of this approach, I think, is to further sectarian division. This is, my humble view, right? I think, and I understand the particular problem of mobilizing people, but then I appreciated the title for this conference. When I first heard from Father Ellis, for example, my initial reaction was, I'm a Christian Palestinian, and yet another one, people, I'm sorry, but I'm a Christian Palestinian, right? And I'm one that says Christian Palestinians are in trouble, not because they're Christian, but because they're Palestinians, right? And I don't want to have that be subsumed in a U.S. desire to identify with me as a Christian rather than to identify with me as a Palestinian. Mm-hmm. There's some real conundrums here.
Yeah, and I don't want to take up too much time, but it kind of gets interesting in a conversation. I will just say that my church had a benefit concert called Iraq for Stand with Iraqi Christians, and we had several Kurdish Muslims show up, and they said, right on, this is great. like, yes, the Christians need help, and anything that brings attention to what's going on over there is good. And I think I would push back a little bit on the idea that to support one group diminishes another. I think if we're out to help everybody, bringing attention to the region and making the point that everybody here is suffering, I think it actually does create a good rather than making the problem worse. I would love to talk more about that with you, but thank you very much.
On the side. Yeah. On the side between the two of you.
We have one last question.
Yes, please, over there.
My name is Pierre Ferris. Every time I visit my family in central South Lebanon, in the Jizin area, for the past few years, I've seen the schism between the Sunni and the Shia increasing. And to that point, I have two nephews, one work in the government in the Ministry of Agriculture, the other one in a large pharmaceuticals. And in both cases, whenever somebody needs to be sent to a Sunni area or Shia area, the Sunni wouldn't go to a Shia area because of security or safety concerns, and vice versa, the Shia wouldn't go to a Sunni area. But their bosses, since they're both Maronites, they would send them, and they're happy to go to either area to serve whatever service or whatever they're doing. My question is, in your expert opinion, do you find this prevalent in Lebanon or South Lebanon, or there is wider practice of that? And if this is the case, in this case, the role of Christians, in this case professional Christians, being pushed into serving that role as a bridge between the two.
Well, I wish you had many nephews. I think, unfortunately, the story you've told us is more of an exception rather than the rule. I think that in the present division among, at least in Lebanon, but that's true of Syria too, and Iraq, I think Christians themselves are polarized. Some are for political reasons on the side of Shiite parties, and some are on the side of Sunni parties. And a large majority is kind of withdrawn. This sense of being agents of reconciliation, of being peacemakers, of being bridge builders, that was prevalent among Christians for many, many years in Lebanon and beyond, is partly lost, but we have no reason to give up. I mean, regeneration is possible, people like your nephews.
But if I may, your observation is correct about villages in Lebanon, not about the cities in Lebanon. The villages in Lebanon are either purely homogeneous of one sect, or they are heterogeneous, two mixed. Wherever there is a mixed society in villages, it's usually a Christian and another. You don't find a Sunni Shiite village. You don't find a Durzi Sunni village. You don't find a Durzi Shiite. But you find a Christian with all the others. And thus, your conclusion that the Christian is accepted as a mediator. If that is true, and we cannot carry it to we can carry it to an extreme, it would be very good for the Christians to play that role. But I don't know whether it is that easy, because we're also divided.
Yeah, they were not mediators in the Civil War.
No, any other question?
I really appreciate what both of you have said, because it's something that bothers me deeply. I have to keep this as vague as possible, okay? I have spoken to Christians from northeastern Iraq and from western Aleppo, and been shocked. One group I was asking, well, what do you experience about what's going on across the city from you? And well, that's their problem. Another person that, well, if it wasn't for the Shabaks, for God's sake, they're even smaller than the Yazidis. But it was the Shabaks' fault. And I'm thinking, it's going to end up, when I hear of safe areas, all I can think of is Srebrenica. And then there's a politicization of the plight of Christians that I really even calls for arming Christians. It's not only not going to help, it's going to make it worse. And if I can just put on a spiritual hat that I don't always feel comfortable with, we go that route and we lose our soul as Christians. Thank you.
Other questions? This side? Well,
since there are no other questions, I can ask a second one. I agree with Dr. Azzam about the singling out of Christians for protection is a big problem. And for me, as a Christian and a theologian living in the North America, has been almost become a mission over the last few years to dismantle this whole. I find it problematic. And even titles of this conference, despite the good intentions, I find it problematic. Starting with the change of language with the letter of Cardinal Sardini from minorities to presence continues to be problematic because it still plays around the outsiders in the region rather than indigenous people. So in a way, I wonder how can we reframe the conversation in a way that's actually helpful rather than contributes to the problem.
Part of what I was suggesting in my talk is using human rights language as a way of reframing, because it was an interesting story told. I was reading about when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being written by this committee in the United Nations. There was this big debate going on between Charles Malik, who was the UN ambassador of Lebanon, the Lebanese ambassador to the UN, who was a member of the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration, and the Chinese delegate in that committee as well, where Charles Malik, and actually with the support of some other members of the committee, wanted to insert God in the Universal Declaration, endowed by God with reason and conscience, right? And there was a lot of opposition to that. And the Chinese delegate said to Charles Malik, look, go read Confucius for 2 years, then come back to me and tell me about inserting God. So, in a sense, that kind of universalization of the same moral values that we have in Christianity, in Islam, in Buddhism, in Confucianism, etc., helps us a little bit out of that morass of this is the box from which I speak only. And I think that could offer us something. And I would add one other thing to that is we are talking about when Christians are a persecuted minority in parts of the Middle East, let's say. But that's not to say that, being Christian, that they are perfect. Because in most other instances in history, it was the Christians who were the persecutors. And we've seen it time and time again everywhere. Being Christian is not ipso facto good. It's how you understand your Christianity, how you understand your faith, how you interpret it, how you live it, how you, all of that. The problem in the Balkans was even more, before it hit on the Bosnian Muslims, it was between the Catholic Croatians and the Orthodox Serbians, and massacres occurred there before they occurred with the Bosnians. So, let's not suffer any illusions here. And as I was saying earlier, no one has a monopoly on racism, on discrimination, on victimhood, and all of that. Just have a long view of history and really try and find that language, which I think human rights does provide that language, at least in terms of the text, in terms of the best that humanity has been able to arrive at in discussion at a political level. Because human rights texts and treaties are not morality. They are political agreements between states. And that gives them a kind of power that's a little bit different, that can bolster the faith-based kind of power that you can harness. I'll stop here. Do you want to add?
We have one last question.
Sure. Thank you for your presentations. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the importance of history and the way we even approach this question of whether there's value added in thinking about Christians in the Middle East, because all of your presentations tended to focus on what's happening with Christians since the events of the Arab Spring, as though the current condition of Christians can be restricted to 5 years of state failure and communal and sectarian violence. And yet, as the early presentations made very clear, if we look at the trend line when it comes to the sustainability of indigenous Christian communities that are organic to the fabric of the region, we have seen a steady decline, certainly precipitous since the establishment of states in the regions, but even longer than that. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what is really a historiographical project that needs to be done, which is to, in some ways, re-examine the way in which Christians as a category have been classified in the region, and therefore the way in which their decline or their sustainability has been affected by that categorization. Because you tend again to focus mainly on, when you talk about a human rights regime, on issues of persecution or violence, and yet, as we know full well, the decline of Christians has come through violence, but it's also been a product of all sorts of non-violent economic, political, and cultural forms of violation of the human rights regime that you talk about. And this gives us a window into what's been done to other vulnerable communities as well. So would Christians be valuable in thinking about that dynamic as it applies more broadly to other vulnerable communities?
Who would like to take that?
No, I don't really, I'm not a historian myself, and I'm not very good on Christian history in particular. I would just consider this, that, if indeed history goes in cycles, and it goes and there are the context to each historical epoch, economic context, context of power, context of authority. One of the elements that one could consider, for example, in the migration patterns of Christians from the region is that, and again, I have no proof of that, I'm just kind of guessing and wondering if that's worthy of research, is it easier for a Christian Arab to gain immigration status in Europe and North America than for a Muslim Arab? I don't know. I'm just wondering if that was a factor. Certainly in the early 1900s, in the first migration of Lebanese and Syrians, for example, the Great Famine, whether there is, it will not be outrightly clear. It's not saying, it won't say that in the documents. But I'm just saying that, when an officer sits and reviews, an immigration officer, an application of citizenship for immigration, whether that factor has actually had an effect on an increased migration of Christians from the region for the same kinds of political opportunities, economic opportunities that Muslims tried to seek the migration. The other thing to look at are other communities. You think about the Lebanese Shia working in Africa, for example, in West Africa in particular. Huge numbers, huge. And they've gone and they've made amazing economic opportunities for themselves. And it seems to be a phenomenon mainly, mainly related to the Shia of Lebanon, more so than others. Now that's an interesting phenomenon. Why is that? I don't know. So it'll be actually interesting to do what you're suggesting, as to a much more historical long view analysis, but also not limited only to the question of Christians, but to see what are these migration patterns and what are the economic implications. And again, as I was saying earlier, look at a political economy of all of these things. I know it sounds a little bit Marxist for lots of people, but I think it's important. It is important. When people migrate in numbers, there are political, military, economic, and other reasons for it. It's not just faith.
Yeah, I think it's important as we look into the history of Christians in the Arab Muslim world to recognize that former dhimmi status has given them protection, unlike what happened in other parts of the world, where the other was eliminated by force, could not be tolerated. But this was a protection that led to a gradual marginalization. And this has gone on for centuries, and therefore the energies of Christians throughout this process had been depleted, and their numbers dwindled. I mean, it's been said this morning, and I repeated that Christians were a majority in Syria until the late 12th century, early 13th. Then numbers started dwindling, and energies were depleted, role became increasingly marginal. Now, something radical happened towards the turn of the century, actually following the Ottoman Tanzimat in the 1860s, 1870s, whereby this pact of citizenship with the superior protecting the inferior has been superseded by a new pact. Independent states were based on a pact of citizenship, whether it was explicit in constitutional texts or implicit in the consciousness of people, whoever they are, Christians and Muslims. And the fear is that with state institutions collapsing today, that this pact could go away, and somehow we need to resuscitate. We need to retrieve this pact, and don't, without falling into the trap of constant self-victimization, responding to marginalization by self-marginalization, and becoming de facto, Christians becoming de facto advocates of a neo-dhimmi status, where they would see themselves as a self-centered, self-enclaved, weakened minority seeking protection.
And thus ends session 2, and we begin session 3. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.